What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to Red Top Report. I am your host, Joe Gallagher, and it is Friday, so you know what that means. It is the JQ with B. Joe's Questions with Dr. William Mahoney. Doctor, thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Joe.
How was your Thanksgiving?
It was really good. I actually went to Boris's house. There was about maybe 20, 25 of us there. It was really good.
Oh, that's a big turnout.
Simon made 2 turkeys, and they were amazing.
Awesome. Yeah, Simon is actually a really good cook. I remember one time, this had to have been years ago, but he did these deep fried Snickers.
Oh, yeah.
Or deep fried Oreos or something, but it was pretty good. But we have some good questions this week. And the first one, we are going to actually tap on your expertise. It has to do with Mama Mary. And so without further ado, let's dive right in, yeah? Why did the Marian aspect grow later in church history? And, so this is a twofer, and do I have to believe she was sinless and assumed into heaven to be Catholic?
I'll do the first part and then the second part.
Okay,
I heard two questions. Well, the first has to do with this question of the development of doctrine. So the idea that it grew later, I wouldn't say you can't say the doctrines didn't grow later. The church's understanding grew later and became fuller. So in dogmatic theology, it's pretty much theological consensus that the deposit of faith, right? Everything handed to the apostles ended with the death of the last apostle. So everything they taught and they spread on is part of the deposit of faith. That doesn't mean that the church as a whole always perfectly understands what's been handed on. So that can grow. The church's understanding of what has been passed on can grow. We don't just look to Scripture, of course. And St. Paul even said, hold fast to the traditions I handed unto you, right? Mm-hmm. So there were many things the apostles said and taught that are not in Scripture, but are part of tradition and part, therefore, of the truth of revelation. St. John even says, if we were to record everything Jesus said and did, the world itself couldn't contain the books. Yeah. So we know there's so much more than just what's in the Bible. And this is why we also look to tradition.
Right.
So that so all these truths about Mary, they're there in the deposit of faith. The church just comes to a better understanding over time. And then sometimes when there's conflict over a question, they'll define it clearly. So early in the church, the first one was she Mother of God? That was the first Marian heresy, the Theotokos, yes. Right? The Nestorian heresy.
Right.
And that heresy was actually not primarily about Mary, it was about Jesus, because it was about dividing Jesus into 2 natures, into 2 separate persons, whereas he's one person with 2 natures. And in order to keep that integrity of that dogma of the Catholic faith, it has to be understood that Mary is in fact the Mother of God. Otherwise, you have 2 persons. So it was more indirectly about Mary.
Yeah,
defining
that's
her.
Interesting that when you're defining Our Lady's role, it is intimately entwined with Christology. And so even with the Theotokos and understanding that reality of the faith, it was actually a Christological heresy that needed to be hashed out.
Exactly right. And that's the case with all of them in seed. So everything, without Christology, there is no Mariology. Mm-hmm. So it's always about, we believe this about Mary because we believe this about Jesus. So that's that one. And then the next one is her perpetual virginity. So that came into question.
Right. And
the church is clear about that too. They've defined the before and the after. The during is by, the during is I think it's a sententia certa. It's a certain sentence because if she's a virgin before and after, then obviously during.
Yes.
She didn't lose it and then get it back. So the church defines that as well. So that's that understanding. When we come to the second part of the question.
Yes, that is, do I have to believe she was sinless and assumed to be Catholic? And I just have one thought, and just tell me if I'm understanding what you were saying earlier. You're saying, it's just the church's understanding. And this is what, makes Father Martin or the Synodal Way so errant, because God in his infinitude, in his never-endingness, is a pure and simple truth, and it's just our capacity to understand that truth, almost like he's this amazing light, and we in our intellects, the church on earth, are a camera lens growing and growing to be able to start capturing the whole picture over time. But the light doesn't change. It's just our ability, our capacity to capture it expands over time. Fair?
That is fair. And it's also fair to say he's revealed He's revealed everything necessary for our salvation. He's not told us everything of the mysteries of heaven. How could he? We wouldn't understand anyway.
Yeah, because then how would somebody from 100 AD be able to be saved if it required more knowledge 2,000 years later to be saved? He already did that when he died on the cross.
That's correct.
And justified.
And you don't want to stray too far into knowledge for salvation. You'll end up in Gnosticism. It's ultimately faith, which is belief that in fact he is who he says he is, and then all these things flowing from that.
Yeah, how many great saints were there that were saying, "Oh, you're too dumb to do this. You can't give sermons. You're not smart." But
Doesn't
then
matter.
They act, and they're the doorkeeper. They're the ones that are doing all the terrible jobs, but they do it with love and with faith, and that's what made them great saints.
Absolutely, and there's even an allusion to that in the gospel, because he says the one who who knew the Father's will and didn't do it gets a severe beating, whereas the one who didn't know but did it, basically.
Yeah, that's
so
interesting.
it really comes down to ultimately like how he looks at us. He looks at your heart, and that's something nobody can know but him.
Right. So do I have to believe she was sinless and assumed to be Catholic?
Yes. Well, yes.
It's dogma of the church.
They're both dogmas of the church. The Immaculate Conception, which speaks to her sinlessness, was defined by Pius IX in 1854. And then the Assumption was defined by Pius XII in 1950-ish. I think 1950.
Hey, that's impressively proximal. So
yeah, it's really close. Anyway, but those were defined. So when they were defined under penalty of anathema, both of those were cases of the Pope using his privilege to be ensured of infallibility. And they made that clear in both cases. They followed all the correct Vatican I formula for that. And which means that it is now binding on your faith, which means it's not that even that you say it and you don't believe it internally. It's binding on your faith, meaning it's part of what you believe. Otherwise, you're not Catholic. So that doesn't mean, okay, but I will say this, just one more thing. That doesn't mean you have to understand it. Okay. Because you still might struggle with how that's so, but you have to believe that it is so.
Right.
An example of this kind of faith is from Mary herself. When the angel told her that, about the incarnation, she said, "How can this be? I don't know man." She didn't doubt him. She just didn't understand. So that's fine not to understand. And because of her faith, notice she wasn't punished. She was given an explanation. Unlike Zachary, just a little bit before in the same Gospel of Luke, didn't believe the angel, in which case he was silenced, because faith comes first, understanding comes later. Like St. Anselm defines theology as faith seeking understanding. If you try to understand so that you believe, you're going to end up in very bad waters. But rather, he says, you believe so that you can understand.
No, beautifully said. We're running out on time. So
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. This is your expertise. It's Mama Mary. So we're going to pick with one question, but they are both related to confession. So the one that I think that we should go for is, I don't trust most priests. So I have not confessed for a long, long time. I confess all my sins, present and past, as part of my daily prayers. Am I committing a sin?
Again, I heard multiple. There's few parts in there.
Find it again.
But no, I got it. I got it. I got it.
Okay. So I can put it down?
Yes, yeah. Well,
every time.
Sorry. I'm sorry. I'm difficult. Yeah. So as to the first part, not trusting priests, that's fair in this environment. We don't trust a lot of priests. But don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Don't cut your nose off to spite your face. And if you can come up with any other...
Don't bite the hand that feeds you?
Actually that's not that bad. Yeah. In fact, quite literally, he feeds you, the Eucharist. So, and this speaks to the Donatist heresy. The man dispensing the sacraments doesn't have to be personally holy. He can be a mess. He can be whatever. The sacrament still happens if he follows the proper matter and form. So if you go to a priest, no matter how terrible he is, and you confess, and he says the correct things, which is, "I absolve you," if he says that, then you're absolved, regardless of who he is. So I understand, and I can understand that you might not want to go to certain priests. So don't find another one that you can go to, or if you want, make sure there's the veil, and just go anonymously.
But do they have to? Do they have to go? From my understanding, you have to go to confession once a year.
Yeah,
sorry. I'm jumping.
No, I appreciate it. That was just the first part of it. That's it. So second part,
Oh, my turn? I'm not Dr. Mahoney. I'm just offering my insights. But I believe the church says you have to go to confession and receive Holy Communion once a year, correct?
Yes, you must go to confession once a year and confess mortal sin at least once a year. But understand with the rules of the church, this is like the bare minimum. That's like you need to eat once every 2 weeks so you don't die, right? So it's like the bare minimum, but you probably should eat more. You know, same thing here. You're nourishing yourself. So whether or not, if this gentleman doesn't go at least once a year, then you are adding a sin because you're disobeying one of the church's rules. How serious it is, I mean, there's lots of factors to that, but
which we have covered.
We have, yes, but so at least go once a year, and then you avoid sin. If you've committed mortal sin, you have to go before you receive Holy Communion,
or before you die,
right?
Yeah,
and then
or both.
And then, and then I would also speak to just quickly the frequency of going to confession is extremely valuable. Even if you don't have mortal sins to confess, you're only obliged to confess your mortal sins once a year. But even if you don't have any, confess your venial sins. You can even confess your faults.
What if you don't know any sins? You can't think of any.
Think harder. So, because
that's true.
The truth is the closer you get to God, you might not be dealing with sin, but you might have some faults, some imperfections in your love, anything like that. So, I mean, to say I can't think of any sins, so you can find nothing imperfect in what you've done. You've lived a perfect life just like Jesus Christ.
Even a just man sins 7 times a day.
Exactly. So, think harder. Ask God to help you, show you the little parts of your heart that are holding back, because we're not perfected until we're in heaven. So there's always something. You're not obliged to confess your faults, but I think it's very valuable to do even that. Like maybe you did a good thing, but a little bit poorly, or maybe you missed a good opportunity. Maybe you should have done something good, but you didn't. So all these things, like you can just bring all that to the confessional, and the value of that. If anyone's interested in the value of that, there's a really good explanation of that in Mystici Corporis Christi of Pius XII, who also defined the Assumption.
It all comes full circle.
But if you can go find that online and read through that encyclical, and he talks about going to confession frequently, right, is so valuable, even if you're just confessing some faults and all, because it strengthens your will, it cleanses your soul. So many things he lists, but basically it brings you closer to our Lord.
Sure. Would it be fair to say, I mean, venially speaking, we're not talking about mortal sin, but venially speaking, to grow in the spiritual life, and then of course we'll wrap up. I just want your take on my final thing, and then we'll wrap. But so the spiritual life is accepting opportunities to cooperate with grace, cooperating with grace when you find the opportunities to do the best thing, or the according to your judgment with a properly formed conscience, to reflect God, to do good, to cooperate with grace. Now, if you identify those scenarios and you reject them for personal comfort, personal pleasures, for an instant gratification, that's a rejection of God's further invitation to grow closer to him. So if you recognize those opportunities, like, I could be nicer, or like I could say a rosary right now, or I could do this, and I say, no, I think I'm just going to watch TV, for example. Would it be fair to say that in some instances that could be venially sinful because you're rejecting God for your own decisions? You're placing yourself as your own God before him. Is that fair to say without getting too much in the weeds?
I think that's fair. I mean, of course, we're talking about the gravity of it. So there's the sin that just you're going to hell. I don't think you're going to hell for these types of things, of course. But there's imperfections there. I mean, ultimately, what it comes down to is God gave you everything, quite literally, till the last drop of his blood. The last thing to be destroyed in his body was his heart, pierced with a lance. He can't show greater love than he already has. So he demands it in return, based on your state in life and everything else. He's done everything for you. So if you're holding back even the smallest thing in your heart, I think maybe I should go to confession. No, I don't like the priest. I'll just pray. That desire to go to confession was probably a grace of God, respond to it, find a way to go. So, and then when you examine your conscience, like look deep into your heart, look at all the little places where I could have loved better. I should have been more generous. That's the gospel is about generosity. Freely you've been given, so freely give, he tells the apostles. So you've been given everything freely. So just be totally generous.
Blessed be God. Blessed be God. Dr. Mahoney, thank you for coming on. Have a great weekend.
Thank you. You too.
All right. We'll see you next week. Guys, if you enjoyed this episode of Red Top Report, please be sure to subscribe to the channel. Send this to somebody that you think is wavering in the faith and they need to know a little bit more. We have a wellspring of knowledge from Dr. Mahoney, and he's been gracious enough to give us his time to answer your questions. Again, also, if you would like to submit a question, you can click the link below in the description, fill out the form, and we'll do our best to get to it. Again, thank you so much for watching Red Top Report. I would say also subscribe to us on Patreon and support us there, but we've actually been canceled because of hate speech. So don't you dare talk about the gays. We'll catch you next time on Red Top Report. God bless. Run into the box, run it, check it.